about to start. So those of you back there, please come in quietly. Now we want to welcome you to the continuation. I want to welcome you to the continuation of the TRC thematic and institutional hearings. And today we're conducting a hearing here at the office of the TRC. And want to invite all of you who are here. And to officially begin, I ask that we kindly stand to observe a few moments of silent prayer. And in that moment, let us please remember those who lost their lives during our turbulent period. I will ask you to kindly remain standing as we administer the oath.
I, Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, do solemnly swear that my testimony that I've come to give to the TRC of Liberia is the truth and nothing but the bullshit. So help me God.
We want to formally welcome you to this session of the TRC's thematic public hearings. In the same vein, we want to thank you very much for honoring the invitation of the Commission to come and share your experience and perspectives with the Commission and the people of Liberia. We realize you have a very tight and hectic schedule, but I was still manage to find time to come to the Commission on these traditions for the purpose of making your contribution to the process of soul searching of our nation and finding the basis for national reconciliation and peace. For us at the Commission, we feel it is a patriotic undertaking of all Liberians to support this process, which is meant to lay the foundation for future progress of our nation, and at the same time find a way out of our situation so that reconciliation can be an enduring process for our country. We thank you for the support you've given to the process, which is further manifested by your presence. At the Commission, we felt that our investigation will be incomplete if we do not speak, if we do not hear, we don't give the opportunity to persons, Liberians who have been around during the period of 79 to 2003, who have peculiar knowledge about what transpired during that period, who have made contributions or who participated one way or another as activists or otherwise. We realized that in the 70s, leading up to 1979, we were a public official, and then after the military coup, we became an opposition party. Several times going to jail, being tried for treason, and then our country progressed on 1985 up to 1990 when there was a civil uprising by way of the war. All of that eventually there have been a lot said about your rule during that period from 1985 up to 1990. And then eventually we participated in the 1997 elections, and then the subsequent elections which have brought us this far. Against that background, the Commission felt will be very useful for the process, for us to hear from you, for us to give you the opportunity to share your experience, your perspectives, and perhaps recommendations on how our country can move forward beyond our current situation. With that, we want to see you, Madam Witness. Thanks very much for coming, and you are cordially welcome. I will take this time just before you move into your presentation to introduce commissioners who are here present. We are the commissioners, others are not here for reasons beyond our control. On our left is Commissioner Sheikh Kapu Makone. Next to him is Commissioner Umu Sila. Next to her, immediate at my left is Commissioner Terafuma. And immediate at my right is Commissioner Brown. I see radio. And then we have Dr. Evans of the International Technical Advisors. I want to thank you once more.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner. I said I would be here, and I'm here. Allow me to start with a little bit of perspective. I grew up in a family that represented the diversity of this nation. The good and the bad, you might say. My grandmother, my mother's mother, came from Sinkor County. That's where my mother was born. She was an illiterate who had never come to Monrovia. My mother grew up there until such time that she was taken by a family in Monrovia, the Donmar family, and where she was raised. And the reason she was taken is that my grandmother was married in a traditional way to a German merchant. And so she was very fair and looked very much like a white person. And so that attracted her to many families in Monrovia. She was finally taken by the Donmar family. And my grandmother allowed her to come to Monrovia so she would be able to get an education. My father was a Gula. His father was Chief Jamali, a very renowned Gula chief. His name was also changed from Jamali to Johnson because of the interaction of Chief Jamali with Elijah Johnson and all of those things. But my grandmother, my father's mother, was also an illiterate. She was Gula. She never came to Monrovia. And so my father also was brought to Monrovia to live in a family, democratic family, where he lived and he became an apprentice at law. So in our family, like I said, respecting the diversity, we had two grandmothers that until they died, they could not read or write. They knew poverty, they knew degradation. But I also had mother and father that grew up in an elitist atmosphere and went to an education, so you might say that they passed. And so they knew the good life that came from what was then called the Congo people. But I'm glad that we never forgot our roots. We spent a lot of time in the village. We gave to our village, we did our traditional village that we go to even today with our illiterate Gula grandmother. And our illiterate Kru grandmother spent a lot of time with us in Monrovia. And as a result, I think today we all have a different perspective on who we are and what life we are all. I then, you might say my activism started In 1955, which was the year I graduated from the College of West Africa. And that was the year when there was the attempted coup with the President Tubman was there. The Tubman and the Executive Mansion was then the old mansion on National Street. You know, TWA is just a little bit up the hill from there. And during the attempted coup, the soldiers were all in the streets. And many of us then came out and had to go into the bushes to watch what was going on. And that was when, I forget who it was, attempted a coup against Tubman, but it ended up with David Coleman being the one that was eventually charged. And I remember until this day a photograph in a local newspaper that read, from this to this. The from this was David Coleman in a suit with a top hat. To this, his riddled body in a kinja. I got married right after high school. And so activism for me came to an end, except these things that were implanted upon my mind. And it wasn't until four children later, when I went back to school, to college, and did not come back into, you may call it, professional political life, until I returned home after college and went to work for what was then the Department of the Treasury. It was in 1964. I was merely a junior professional. I worked on a Jimmy Weeks. And in 69 was the first time you may say that I spoke out against what was going on in society. This was a development conference at the University of Liberia that was programmed by what was then the Harvard University team that was working with our Ministry of Planning and Economic Affairs. And I represented the Department of Treasury at that conference. And I made certain statements about the policies of government and why changes was necessary in the society. It was felt that I would get in trouble as a result of what I said. And Dr. Patriotic, the head of the Harvard team, then quickly arranged for me to leave the country and to go to Harvard for graduate study. One might say that a little touch of activism came at Harvard because at that time there was a protest against the Vietnam War. And I happened to have joined some of the protests, though I was not American, and had no problem with the Vietnamese or the Americans, but joined it anyway because it was an exciting thing to do. After my completion, I returned home in 1971. President Tubman had died, and President Tubman had taken over as the Minister of Finance, to which I was returning, then called the Minister of Finance, with Stephen Colbert as the minister. I worked, and then in 1972, I gave the famous TWA speech when I spoke at the commencement address of my alma mater. And that speech pointed out what I said were some serious distortions in our society and in our policies. That the great divide that we had faced in our country still existed. That resources were not used to unify the people. In any case, many will remember, and that speech is available today, that in 72, we have predicted a coup d'etat, which finally came in 1980. That speech got me into problems with the Toba government, and ultimately I had to leave In 1973, I left the government and went, you might say, to exile with a job with the World Bank. And I stayed at the bank until 1977. During that period, I was not involved in any activism. I was busy with my professional life. In 1977, Steve Tober had died, and Jim Phillips had taken over as the Minister of Finance. He was able to persuade the bank to enable me to come back home. Of course, we had, during that period, was the preparation of the OAU conference, and of course, in 1979 was the infamous race riots. After the riots, I was one of those who served on the Brownell Commission that made certain recommendations to government, and I have a copy of the Brownell Commission's report, which I can later get over to you through my signature on it, in which we made certain recommendations to the government about trying to change the political situation. As you may know, those recommendations were not respected. But ultimately, Minister Phillips was, in a way, held responsible, and President Tober asked me to assume in August of 1979 the position of Minister of Finance, which I held until the April 1980 coup d'etat. I was removed from the position, but I was one of the 4 ministers that was saved by the TRC. Myself, Kit Bryant, who was then the Minister of Health and Social Welfare, Gilbert Tucker, who was then the Minister of Public Works, and Lieutenant Gunso, who was then the Minister of Rural Development. And I can't see why we were saved, except the perception of those of the coup makers who may have thought we were not the aggressors. In any case, I was one of those who felt that the change that had come, that we in a way had brought it on ourselves because of our failure to have made those changes in society over all the many years. And so I took a position in the Dole government. I was asked to serve as the president of the Liberian Development Bank. There were many of the old order who thought that because I took a position in the Dole government, and because in a way we endorsed the Dole government, that we were part of the coup makers, and that we knew of the coup. That was far from the truth. Did not know it, did not know any of them. But again, like I say, many of us felt that it was time to be positive. And I then, at the end of 1970, after the coup, 1980, at the end of 1980, after the coup, it was clear, even though I took a position we're working, that many of us were staying as part of the old order. And so we were always confronted with, these old people, who stay in this government, they were not something. And so at the end of 1980, because I was on secondment from the World Bank, I asked the bank to ask the government to release me back to the service of the bank, which they did. And I went back to Washington. And the following year, of course, I went to work with the Citibank in Nairobi. I stayed there until the call for general elections in '85, and I was, asked by many of my colleagues to come and join in forming a party which was then the Liberia Action Party. And so I came and we did form the party. As many will know, the party was not allowed to be registered. I then left I left the country in July of '85, and I was invited to go and speak at the Union of Liberian Association, ULA, in the United States. And the person who happened to have been president of the union at that time was Tom Lee. And so I went and spoke in Philadelphia, where the meeting was held. And again, it was a pretty tough speech in which, having come to Liberia back and forth in the dual government and having seen what I consider to be a deterioration in what was happening in the country, with so many of the TRC members having been killed, with what happened with the university students, etc. I took a pretty tough position in that statement also. And when I returned, I was put on a house arrest. I was called, the details of that, you can get if you want. But I was called before President Joe and others, subsequently with Justice Minister Scott at the time, taken on a house arrest where I stayed for a while, and because there was some interaction with the public, I finally ended up being taken from my home on a house arrest and was then taken to Post Stockade.
Can you maybe adjust the microphone so that I can hear you?
I then was looking for Post Stockade, and I happened to have been there with quite a few university students. And we stayed in there for about a couple of months. I was charged with sedition and taken before a military tribunal, where after this proceedings I was declared guilty and sentenced to 10 years as hard labor. And at this time, of course, there was a lot of attention to those political proceedings. So I did not serve the full term, served for 2 months then. And while I was in prison, our party was in registered. And I came out. And there were attempts for me to renounce and to leave, and I protested I would not do that. And so I did go in campaign for then that presidential candidate was Jackson Doe, with Emmanuel Kuma as the vice presidential candidate. And we went in campaign very heavily. We did that won the election, but the official results did not accept that. And then there was the Freedom Bar coup that followed the election in December of '85. And again, there were few people that were in touch, with the Freedom Bar group. I think he was trying to get some transportation from people like Jim Holder and Robert Phillips, who was in country, all of them, and Harrington Street. I don't think they were ever able to give help. I was aware that they were trying to get transportation help from these people. And so, and we at that time were actively engaged in trying to point out the excesses of the dual government, fighting for political change. And so on the day of the coup, when everyone thought that the Sinkor had a new succeeded, Mr. Phillips did come into my yard, even the coup. And we came outside and we were all happy, change had come. Of course, as we all know, the coup failed. And so I got arrested again. I had people that took out when in the coup, I was then taken to the military base. gunshots. I can only assume that they were killed since they never came back. And there's a whole episode on how I was taken there, which will come out in details, but as things will happen, I eventually was taken from there and taken to Sympathy, where so many of the political opposition were in there. We stayed in the central prison for 7 months. We were all then released in '86, and I went into exile and went to the United States. Many people know that during the period when I came out of prison until I was able to escape, I went through a lot of surveillance. I slept in different homes at different nights. People were chasing so many of us. With the help of your friends, I was able to get out. I ended up in the United States and started an association with an affiliate of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, and that's when we formed the Association for Constitutional Democracy in Nigeria, ACDL, and actively started a political campaign to point out the excesses of the Bull government and the need for political change. This effort culminated in the conference in Banjul, and at that time during this period, I was in touch with Tom Muriu, because I have said Tom Muriu was the one who was President Makadula, and in fact he testified. I forgot to mention that. At the time there was a hearing in the U.S. Congress, and he testified on my behalf at the U.S. Congress. And in that respect, he was in ACDL, and we did talk and have good relationships. When we went to Banjul, well, let me back up a little bit. ACDL, Tom Muriu, at the time we did not know, Tom Muriu was a part of the Taylor group and NPFL. And he introduced the Taylor Rebellion to many of us in ACDL. There were some of us who agreed with it, who agreed that a rebellion was necessary. And I will admit to you that I was one of those. I did agree that a rebellion was necessary. I myself, I think Harry Green and others. There were others like Ezekiel Pajibo, Patrick Sale, who were members of ACDL, Dr. Sawyer, who may have disagreed that a rebellion was necessary. And so we started to say, well, let's see what it is. But I was never a member of the NPFL. Absolutely not. What I did do was to meet at Tom's request with Mr. Taylor in Paris. When I went for a meeting there, he brought him there one morning to meet with him. And they went through it. I thought it was very strange. People who were making a rebellion at that time in life wanted to call for breakfast, and what we told was the money that you spent for breakfast, give us the money. And so the communication with Tom continued. Harry Reese went out once to be able to assess the situation as to whether truly was this a true rebellion, was it something else here. He came back and his assessment was not that positive. He thought it was just a bunch of people trying to make something but did not have the capacity to do what they wanted. He may have been wrong because he may not have been wrong in detail. In any case, when the rebellion started in December, Christmas Eve, we knew about it, we heard about it. At this point, I also was in touch with people in the State Department of the U.S. because they were also monitoring the situation. I was in Washington. And so they were also in touch with me, feeding me with information and exchanging information on what was happening. We thought this was a genuine rebellion, and it started out to be what we consider the people's movement. Because as it gathered, there was a certain amount of discipline. Elmer Johnson, who came out to join that rebellion, was also living in the Washington area. And when he was coming out, he did tell us that he was coming out to join Patriotic, and that he would bring his military team as he had been in the U.S. military to there to instill some discipline into it. As the story goes, Elmer was of course killed. The thing with Jackson doing other things, we had talked to people about ensuring their safety by taking them behind the lines. They were taking behind the lines and they were reportedly killed back there. And so when I went to Abidjan to participate in the May 1990, let me back up. We then, because there's the thing about the money, we ATDL for a lot of us at ATDL, and I think with the Greens even with letters, and told people soliciting funds. $10,000 was raised and was spent. At that time, spent through the tequila with the hope that we were then having this problem in Nimba between the Liberians and the Manos and the Greens, set as a means of saying what they could do to bring them all together. The whole thing started to be questioned. Was this really, as they progressed, what we saw was the people's group to begin to turn into the usual type of carnage and destruction and what happened? What indeed was there meant to be, what we heard it to be, or what our expectations were based upon the bottom of things with the kids over the years. And so in May 1990, I went to Abidjan to participate in the annual meeting of the Abidjan. I decided I wanted to see what this discipline was all about. The British journalists who were also there wanted to come with me. So we sent a message that we wanted to go across because at the time we had the was right across the river, and I think was looking across the boundary. And so we did go to the boundary side of the Liberian side and stayed there. The British journalist and the message came and said the time. After a few hours, the message came back and said, yes, I could do it, but not the British journalist. I guess by this time it was towards us. And what I saw there, when I went into it, it was great. He was there with a couple of Lebanese and rice and other kinds of things in the morning. And the ranching and loading by him was building his school, food of giant for power, and also, and all of those things. We got the troublemakers, all these other people. I said, not people. A lot of mad-eyed young people who were after that, the news was a town place to be. Finally,
after it finished, I can see that I did not get any sound. You want a microphone down my own bit? I'm sorry. I hope you don't have some good interruption. Like, is it okay?
very well. Is that better? And so I came back to Washington. We still continue to put an ear to listen to support. In July, we thought Mr. Taylor was going to finally take over, and that's when the statement I made about we celebrate and great campaign. And then after that, the whole situation just went downhill. And after the killing of Jackson and Gborplay and others, we then concluded that the whole thing of Mr. Taylor was not what it was meant to be. In 1992, I I then joined the United Nations with UNDP. And from 1992 until 1997, I was a member of the United Nations. And I could not and did not